Hi everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. So I thought I will kick off by introducing our lovely panellists who very kindly agreed to come and speak with us. So first up we have Nichol Wheatley, just here on the far left. So he is a graduate of the Glasgow School of Art. He's got a very varied career behind him, primarily as an artist, also an art teacher. He's had his own art schools. He's been a professional framer. He's also even been a stonemason, a blacksmith and a bouncer. So this diversity is probably what led him to the path of art, and he is probably our longest collaborator with Alasdair that we've got here today, spanning a relationship of 15 years. So he's currently working on, many projects, but in particular a very exciting one about the Bethia, which is the lightning serpent commissioned by the Scottish Canals. And that's going to be, it's a partner piece to the Kelpies further up the river in Falkirk. And I believe that ambitiously it's going to be working with up to 30,000 collaborators. So I thought he'd be perfect for this talk today, understanding deeply all about the process of collaboration. We've also got David Eustace, who is a commercial and fine art photographer, one of Scotland's most famous photographers, I dare say. He's also, he was a high profile and I think fair to say glamorous sort of career with Condé Nast magazine. He's done art direction and photography for Vogue, for GQ, for Tatler, among other places, and he's lived and worked in New York for a 15-year stint. He's also, as I say, an exhibiting artist, recently collaborating with Marchmont House and the Borders, and he's also pivoted into, your last show at the Signet Library in association with the Fine Arts Society was, I think it's fair to say, it was photography, print, sculpture, conceptual pieces and even poetry. It was a real genre-spanning, beautiful exhibition. So David actually came to photography quite late as a mature student, age 28. This is via a career in the Navy and Barlinnie Prison, that's as a guard, not an inmate, I hasten to add, although no judgment here. Yes, he is actually going to be in Byrne's corner for us today because he's a long-term friend of John Byrne's, and in fact that relationship was established when David was still just a student. So we'll hear a little bit more about that relationship shortly. We also have Edwin here on my right, who is the lecturer, typography technician and designer in residence at the Glasgow School of Art. He's also an alumni of the Glasgow School of Art, and he's an academic, artist and designer, so has a real sort of diversity of talents as well. He's exhibited, spoken and collaborated internationally. I sort of want to describe you as the guardian of the letterpress technology up the hill there. And at the moment, speaking of diverse, he's working on a paper with Saoirse here on Alasdair, but he's also working on woodblock printed biosensors with smallholder farmers in Kenya. So this is just a little project he slipped in the middle, and we're really grateful to have him here. And then representing the Glasgow Print Studios, Claire Forsyth, the creative director, has joined us. She's also a professional artist in her own right, also an alumni of Glasgow School of Art. She's shown around the world from Berlin to California. She's worked as a visiting lecturer at Glasgow School of Art and has actually worked with the Print Studios in some capacity since 2008. So again, a long-established relationship there. And she's also been on the Creative Industries Advisory Panel for the Scottish Government. Hopefully this will be a little less stressful as a panel. I'm hoping it's going to be nice and relaxed and enjoyable today. So thank you, Claire. And then finally we've got Scott Campbell, last but not least. He's also an alumni of the Glasgow School of Art and St Martin's. He's the master printmaker of screen print at the Glasgow Print Studios and has been for the last 25 years. With such a long and varied career under his belt, you can imagine he's worked with some of the greatest names in British art, including Patrick Caulfield, Howard Hodgkin, Terry Frost, and of course, Alasdair and John Byrne. So thank you all. As I said, I'm Charlotte Riordan. I'm an associate director here at Line & Turnbull, head of the contemporary sales. Another hat I wear sometimes is a curatorial one, and so I've worked as a co-curator at, namely with Hidden Door Festival, which is working with emerging artists and platforming them, sort of producing work in disused spaces around Edinburgh. So I think it was with that sort of angle that I was interested in this notion of collaborating with artists. But today we're going to be looking at artists who collaborate with artists, and two such well-loved artists as Graham Byrne as well. So I think we're all going to have some interesting insights. revealed to us, and maybe some funny anecdotes as well, hopefully. So without further ado, I'll kick us off. I'd just like to say, if you see me checking my phone, I'm not being ignorant, checking my messages. I'm just going to keep an eye on the time, make sure that everybody has a chance to speak, and that we've got time for a Q&A at the end with your lovely selves. So Nichol, as I said, you go way back with Alasdair Gray, so I'm going to start here. Now, how did your relationship with Gray first come about? And could you talk us through how it evolved, please? Here's a mic.
Thank you very much. So I met Alasdair as he was doing Oranmore, and the Colin Beattie, who commissioned him, Alasdair's greatest patron, asked him, myself, to start in the basement, start painting up, and Alasdair was going to start at the ceiling and start painting down. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, it became fairly evident that Alasdair had incredible plans. So I got scratched, and I didn't really have a problem with that because Alasdair was my hero, though I hadn't actually met him other than a couple of times in the pub. And as he worked through his scheme for Oranmore, which is really worth a visit, it's such an incredible piece, a small Scottish model of the universe, nothing if not ambitious. There were certain technical problems that he came across, and he asked if there was somebody who could help him with the stuff. And my name came up, and we met, and we went out for a drink, and he fell asleep halfway through a sentence, and I'd never met anyone like him. I'd never met anybody who could do what he did. I could never met anyone who thought like he did. And from then on, I helped him with Oranmore, and then we slowly became colleagues in art, which was an utter privilege, probably the honour of my life. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Now, David, as we've said, you were a photographer, and you. What kind of drew me to inviting you here today is that you have actually had sittings with both artists, haven't you? So, actually, on a number of occasions, I think. So, if you could just sort of tell us a little bit about your experience working with them both.
Well, the first thing I've got to say, see if you see me talking about this, I control my ears from this. I am stone deaf, so I'm not being ignorant checking things. I'm just making sure I can hear what people are saying.
And I'm a mumbler.
So I had somebody say that before. You're on your phone, you go, yeah, it's only that people. Anyway, so yes, I was fortunate to photograph both. And it's difficult to compare them because I'd photographed John dozens of times and Alasdair only really the once. But my relationship with Alasdair Gray started before I knew who Alasdair Gray was. Because I used to, one of my first paper rooms at 6:30 in the morning was to 11 Finthorn Street in Ridley, which was actually really quite posh in Ridley where Alasdair grew up. But I never knew who Alasdair Gray was. So how would I describe them? The relationship with John was obviously far deeper, and John knew it was coming. But as characters, I found both very close in many ways and also very different. And the best way I could describe it, I was thinking about it driving through today. When you're with somebody like John, it's a bit like driving on a motorway that you're coming down and you're round the bend and you're doing. With Alasdair, it was going through a country road. You had no idea what was on that next corner or what was going to do. And it was there's people in here who have forgot more about Alasdair Gray than I will ever know, and I'll be honest about that. But I took an instant like to him because I think you just know when you're in the company of someone who thinks different. And I really got that. I just, at one point I used to say, I thought he was as mad as a brush. I love that. I love people with character. And the thing I remember about Alasdair was, that, as I say, I've only worked with him, I think it was twice I took his portrait. But I remember one session, and he just burst into laughter. And I just thought this was brilliant. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. And of course we spoke about the Ridley he knew and the Ridley that I grew up were very different places, and you go from the 30s to the 70s. John was a close friend, you know, and John was everybody's friend. That's what I would say about John Byrne. If you knew John and he liked you, within minutes you felt he was his best friend. If he didn't like you, he told you. You know, John wasn't. The one thing I think I found both photographing was they contribute as much as you can sort of explore with both of them. So they're both really interesting characters, and when students say to me, how do you make an interesting portrait? I said, find interesting people, and both of them had that, you know.
Lovely, thank you. And Edwin, you'll be leading that. You share with Gray an appreciation and support for the potential of the printed word. What can you convey to us about Gray's unique vision in this regard? Because it really is a huge part of his visual sort of language, really, isn't it? His identity.
Yeah, so I think it's defined by a kind of generosity. A need to explain is probably the best way to describe it. So with text, Alasdair's, the more I looked at the way that Alasdair used the text, and the more that I spoke to him about it, and the more that I worked with him, the more I picked up on this overflowing of the text. The text overflows through the paintings, it overflows. The best example is how he uses paratext, so footnotes that he takes as a device from, he used to talk a lot about Flann O'Brien and Flann O'Brien's use of footnotes. But if you see in Alasdair's use of footnotes in Lanark, like how it's overflowing the text isn't big enough to hold everything that he wants to say, to hold everything he wants to explain and everything he needs you, like he wants you to get about what's happening within those stories. So yeah, for me that relationship is about this kind of cup that's not big enough to hold everything that's happening there, a generosity, and this kind of underriding that, this kind of need for other people to get it or to be allowed in, this kind of warmth and openness around the way that Alasdair used text.
Mm-hmm. And playful as well, wasn't it? It was sort of, also including kind of the sort of way he divided up the books, for example, in Lanark. And could you sort of talk us through a little bit how illustration and print kind of interwove?
Yeah, so his use of text is malleable. It's like the way people talk about the plastic arts. It's got this malleability of his use of letter forms in both the way that the letter forms are formed, but his formal use of them. So again, if we talk about paratext in Alasdair Gray's work, about footnotes and those things, he had this rational way of talking about how to structure the book. And it's really rational. It's coming from like the point of kind of taking something apart and starting again with it. And his knowledge was based on, there are people who know more about this, about the way Alasdair was working and about his references here than me. But when we talked about it, it's clear that his knowledge is based on the places and the references and the things that he enjoyed and wanted to pull through, things like Lewis Carroll's Mouse's Tale we used to come back to a lot, Flann O'Brien, all different ways of seeing how text could work in a book, not just in the standard kind of trade typesetting way, but at the same time he's doing interesting things with it, he's picking up from interesting reference points, but at the same time Alasdair's layout doesn't really engage with the niceties of professional typesetting, and lots of professional designers don't, oh God, this is really great, look at the way he's thought about pulling apart the page, but why is he doing it like that? And that rationalism, that need for this sense of a common logic that then excludes some of the kind of professionalism of how other people who spend their whole life working in that technique, what they've learned and picked up. I think there's something really interesting about that, and it really divides people in terms of the design of his books. I think everyone can engage with the way that he's drawing the reader in, but for some people it's just plain rude that you would exclude the professional points of view to that extent. But I think it's just the way he had to do it, because he had to get the thing on the page, and it had to be his way for him to understand that it was doing what he wanted.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Yes, no, that's really interesting. Sort of the play between, I suppose, deliberate kind of impishness and subversion, and actually just this is how he operated, this is how his mind worked. And I suppose also what you're describing, it's probably why he got categorised as postmodern, isn't it? It's kind of there's something going on there that he's disrupting and playing with. Next up, I'm going to direct, if we pass that along, thank you very much. We're going to talk to you, Claire, first, if that's all right. So printmaking, as we know, and in fact, as we can see, mainly actually Gray represented here in this exhibition, they were both printmakers. That was a big feature in both of their artistic output. Can you talk us through their approaches as artists and whether their ambitions for their prints evolved over time?
Yeah, definitely. I was very lucky to know both Alasdair and John. And I'll maybe just say a very brief bit about how they came to the print studio. The Glasgow Print Studio has been in many incarnations, started off as a small co-op and is now a little bit bigger down in Drumgate. But both of them flowed through, I'd say we're already getting the sense of, with this both incredible polymaths with a very open approach to life and making. Alasdair actually first came to us because the larger-than-life director at the time of the print studio, Callum Mackenzie, gave over space in our Ingram Street premises. He welcomed everybody, and indeed a lot of business, I think, was done in the bar around the corner. So it was very much an open house. So a group of writers took up sort of an informal residence in the studio, and they published a few books there, sort of pamphlet books. Those writers that were just hanging about in the other room there were James Kelman, Alasdair Gray, Liz Lockhead, and various others. And that's partly how Alasdair came into orbit of the studio, just through location actually at the start. That was in around, I think, the sort of mid-70s. And the print studio actually published Alasdair's first book, the Tragedy of the White Dog? Comedy of the White Dog, as part of Print Studio Press. And he then started to work with us a bit later on, and he made lithographs that ended up being illustrations as part of the first printing of his seminal book, Lanark. And we then worked with him over a period of time. I'll just jump back to John as well. So John, again, came to us around the same time. So there's obviously some good vibes going on in the 70s. All the good people started migrating and meeting and sharing ideas and thoughts. So John came to the studio, and he was actually the very first published print that we did, which was, I think it was Boy with Moth, maybe. Yeah, Boy with Moth. So the studio is a co-op. It's like a gym for artists where people can come and make prints, but we also publish and commission works and show in our galleries. So this was a new idea that came about, and John Byrne very graciously agreed to be the guinea pig for this. So we started at the top. We published a print with him, and we were very lucky to have an ongoing relationship with both of them until the end of their lives, actually. We published around 38 to 40 prints with Alasdair, and I think actually over 100 with John Byrne. And both of their processes and approaches evolved over that time. Very lucky. It's maybe a bit unusual, sort of to have a generational relationship with somebody. And I'm the newbie at the print studio. I've only been there for 19 years, so just finding my feet. But Alasdair will have has known multiple generations of and John as well, directors and some staff, although we've got a hard time getting rid of people. Scott's been there for 25 years, and a lot of my colleagues have been there for around 40 years. So there's a huge wealth of knowledge, and we're very proud to work with Saoirse in preserving his legacy, Alasdair's. Over time, Scott will tell us a bit more about the process, but you'll see John, I'd say both of them approach things, I keep reading things like millennial texts about manifesting. I'd say all the things to do with manifesting are what both Alasdair and John lived. They trusted that there was enough to go around. They approached every day in a kind of positive way and just followed their instinct into what they were interested in. And that manifested in a really beautiful journey through different techniques, different explorations, incredible amounts of work, and yet somehow very relaxed, and they always had time for you. John was a very, very open, gregarious person, and as David was saying, as soon as you met him, if you were lucky enough for him to like you, you were instantly basically best friends. And I don't think it's a lie to say that I think just about everyone was a little bit in love with John Byrne, because he was just so charismatic and kind and generous with his time. He liked to work shoulder to shoulder, working with people. It's quite unusual. There are polymaths that are coming from theatre or from writing circles or from multiple different ways of working. John in particular liked to be shoulder to shoulder with the members and sit down and have a cheese savoury sandwich with everyone at lunchtime. But he'd be working away, but somehow on the phone to someone about the box set of Tutti Frutti DVD that was coming out, or speaking to an agent whilst doing a doodle that would probably be like, you know, a complete masterpiece type of thing. So yeah, you can see in his huge retrospective at Kelvin Grove, you can see this incredible fluency of his language, and also his interest in music coming into the work. His interest in R&B music means that he's probably one of the very few Scottish artists of this era that was producing artwork that included people of colour and musicians, black musicians as well. So somebody was giving us an incredible outlook to the world and was really holding a mirror up, even to places that maybe we hadn't been yet. So very, very special. And Alasdair, again, also holding a mirror up to a world that was maybe closer to home for a lot of us, but moving on from his beginnings as the city recorder, in some ways, like I would say a lot of his prints and paintings, he carried on being a city recorder for the rest of his life. Because looking at the pictures here, a lot of the paintings are of people that were within his life, and he's recorded a very special period of time in Glasgow. And yeah, so yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks. We're gonna move back over to Nichol. So we're coming back to you, Scott, in a second. That's all right. And just for those at home watching, so Claire, the People's Recorder, Alasdair Gray, actually was that was his official title at the People's Palace in the Glasgow Green for a number of years. So that's another fascinating part of his career that you've alluded to there. And going back to Nichol, I'm going to ask you now, and we're starting to delve a little bit into their processes at this point. So can you tell us about Alasdair's processes of producing these murals, and from the conception of the idea to translating the images from his plans into a physical space? How did it all work?
So to answer that question, there's two questions inherent in that question. One is, what was his intellectual approach, and the second one would be, what is his practical approach? And I feel very bad taking Scott's turn, by the way. So his intellectual approach is amazing, because he completely believed that he was a servant of art. So his job was to serve art. And actually, there's a quote from John Byrne, which is very similar, that to be called to be an artist is a higher calling than to be called to be a priest. And John famously worked 12 hours a day, and Alasdair not far behind. So Alasdair believed that he was a servant of art. So to that end, whenever he was doing any work, whenever he was called to make a piece, a drawing of a friend, or the mural, or a mosaic, or whatever, it had to be absolutely the best piece that he could possibly make. So to that end, it didn't matter about deadlines, it didn't matter about budgets, it didn't matter about any consideration other than it had to be the best piece that he could make. And that was the thing, and I know that caused Saoirse a huge amount of trouble in the Hillhead mural when she was in charge of all of that. But that devotion to making the work was probably one of the most identifying things about him as an artist, because it had to be as good as he could possibly ever make it. And everything else there was no element of compromise. So lots of artists would make the painting, and then when they finished the piece of work, they sell it. Alasdair would not consider it a piece of work unless it was utterly to the limit of what he could do. And to that end, again and again and again, you would have seen works that he made that were continuing to be made, through decades and decades and decades, because he hadn't quite got it right yet. When it comes to the practical thing of the approaching of it, he was somebody who would make the work and then change it and make it and change it and make it. And so it was very much about understanding how the big thing worked. And the thing that I always was completely impressed with when we were working on Oranmore, which is a massive composition, he held the entire thing in his head. So when we were out having a beer or playing a game of chess, he would turn around and go, so the upper left corner, just above the pillar, there's a section there which needs to do this so that it looks good compared with the other section on the other side. And you'd be like, you're sitting there with all of that in your head all the time. How? Because just even to conceive what a drawing is, but to conceive a huge mural like that is amazing. In terms of the practicality of that meant that he then would work through a section, working through it in context of everything else. And then it was paint and then cover back up, paint and then cover back up, and paint and cover back up. And the key element of how he worked was that he reworked things again and again and again, if that answers the question. Mm-hmm. To the extent, one time we were working on the colouring of the Hillhead mural, and he'd done this incredible drawing. The Hillhead mural is this incredible drawing. He'd done it all by hand with his team of wonderful artists who'd helped him, Will Freeborn and others. And then we decided we were going to digitally colour it. So we thought we'd colour it digitally on a computer. So we had a laptop that him and I worked on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I came in and he decided that he wasn't happy with one of the lines on the drawing. So he was carefully Tipp-Xing the screen of the computer so he could change it. So does that, hopefully that answers the question.
And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask that question was that's how you assume it worked, that this was all in this amazing brain, and you have confirmed that, yeah, that's it just sort of transposed somehow from out of his head like that. So thank you, that's fascinating. Scott, you're up now, we'll move back to you. So back to the Print Studios, and so what my understanding of the role of a technician, you're sort of, it's the nature of the job to be a collaborator, isn't it? And you're there to guide and I think reveal the possibilities of the medium.
Well, I think first of all, you've got to get on with the artist. You've got to, you don't get on with every artist, and also you're not going to take it too personal. You're not going to take it too personal. You've got to sort of guide their interpretation of art the way they want to make it and do the best you can. But with both John and Alasdair, I got on really well with both of them, both friends with both. John particularly well, because I had more experience with, well, probably the same amount of experience with both of them, but they were both totally fascinated with observation and detail, and also they were incredible draftspeople. So again, what you're saying, when they produced something that was a painting or a mural, it had to be of an incredibly high standard. So as a printmaker or a master printer, you have to keep that on board. It can't be secondary to that. It has to be as high a standard. So the trouble with something when it's drawn onto a piece of paper or painted on the wall, when you put something through a screen, it's a difficult thing to do. So we just devise certain ways of actually producing John and Alasdair's work that suited their process. Alasdair, like you were saying, he was continually changing his mind. And I worked with Alasdair probably for about 15 years. In the early days, he really changed his mind all the time. And it was so you'd work on something, maybe for a show, get a really good proof done, and he wasn't happy with it. So sometimes he'd proof something 6 times, which is quite a long time to proof something just because of that. And it wasn't anything major. The drawing was already there. It's just maybe a colour tweak or something quite minor that didn't really change it that much in my opinion. But as you're saying, he just would never settle for, unless he knew in his mind that it was right, he wasn't going to sign that off. And it's quite interesting what Edwin was saying about the text part of it, because with Alasdair, the text was never really an issue with us. The text was always placed within the picture, and then everything else just evolved around it. So he never really bothered about the text. There was nothing really, everything else just coming around it. He'd sort of maybe isolate an area and then use colour to enhance a part of the picture that would take you away maybe a bit from the text, isolate a figure or a drawing of a horse or something. But well, the other one, we did Woundscape for our 40/40 show, which again, that was one I proofed about 7 times. So that's quite tiring as a collaborator. And but again, that's your job, and it's fine. So we proofed that, but the show was opening on Thursday night. I got him to sign 5 copies. On the Thursday morning, in the frame. We'd had the show on the Thursday night, and I had an appointment with him on the Friday morning to come back as I was working on numerous things. So he came in the Friday morning and he's going, Scott, I'm not too happy with that Woundscape print that's on the wall. I said, well, we sold the 5 copies last night, Alasdair, so you must have done something right. And he's going, oh. I said, well, the general public are no fools, or are they? And then he said, let's move on to the next one. So I got him to actually sign the other 35 copies, because that was, if I hadn't sold them, he would have gone off on another tangent and just not nipped it in the bud. John was completely different, because he was more, again, his drawing skills were phenomenal, and he'd draw like, and we'd have to make him use quite a sort of dark lead pencil because that just photographs better. So rather than use like a 2B or I don't know if you've got a 2B or a lighter pencil, we get to draw as dark as possible because that makes it much more easy to produce as a silk screen. So you do these incredible drawings, but you had to print them as incredible drawings. If you sort of didn't do that, they were just lost in translation. So he got that down. It was almost like a starting point for John. Then he'd just sort of go into his own little world, and he was sort of quite whimsical, and he'd sort of hand colour things, and just much more organic and less concerned about things being the same, just much more sort of varied in his approach. But that sort of initial observing something and drawing it in a way, we were both probably on sort of equal paths with that. But John Byrne was also he liked mono. I did quite a lot of mono printing with John Byrne, which is quite a new thing that I'd say the print studio developed that with him. So again, you get a screen set up and you just give him his drawing materials and he'd draw something. So he'd draw something in a way that he loved. So again, you had to try and reproduce that the way he's done it on the screen. So we do when you've got something like that, you can't naturally pull it through and get an image to look the way it's meant to look in one impression. So I'd pull through what I would call sort of ghost proofs. So there'd be 3 or 4 images of the same image on 4 different pieces of paper, and John would pick one that he liked the best and almost sign that one as it was, maybe a little tweak. Then the other 3 you just sort of do a varied thing on. So that was always quite nice as well.
I think it's dawned on me speaking to you there that I think screen printing really suited Alasdair's style because it is very graphic. And obviously, actually, it was a sort of commercial medium before it was ever a fine art one. But and if you actually look at a lot of his portraits today, it's almost like the printmaking informed actually how he approached his original drawings as well. Because he did do these sort of black backgrounds originally. So the 2 works in the corner are earlier ones that he did colorise the background at the time, but later it was actually latterly that he went back and revisited old sketches and coloured in the colour block the background. So it almost seems that the screen printing informed the sort of the art process. It's it was much
more calculated the way he sort of made things. He loved the Pantone book, which is just a colour reference book that had got thousands of different colours, which is not good for Alasdair. So he'd go through a range of reds, and it'd be a 186 red, and then it'd be a 204 red, and just goes on and on. But it served the purpose, and he loved his Pantone book, whereas John Byrne wouldn't go near a Pantone book. If I said to John, what colour is his background going to be? He said, I want it orange. And I said, what type of orange? And he'd chuck a tangerine at me and say, that colour of orange. So then I'd go back with the print and he'd have the tangerine sitting there and he'd put the tangerine on top of the picture and it'd be a perfect match. So it's a bit like that, but Alasdair, he liked to be, I don't know, he was very graphic, as you say. He was very considered and much more sort of thought out process really, which is perfect for silkscreen really. It's translated quite easily.
Yes. Well, speaking of graphics, I think that's a good moment to move back to Edwin. So we're going to chat about your project with Gray. So this was the collaboration on achieving his typeface, that ubiquitous typeface that I'm sure everybody here is very well familiar with. So how does that work? How did you do that together?
Okay, so how did that work? I'd known Alasdair for a bit before we started doing that. It was obviously later in his career. We met a few times, we talked about working together on some things. We'd done a talk together in the art school. And then he emailed me from the hospital, actually, and I think he'd got a bit of a kind of, I better get on with some, I've got a list of things that I'm intending to do and I better get on with some of them. And the first thing he wanted to do with his letters, so Alasdair's letters had been evolving for a long time, and you see what ended up being used for Alasdair's typeface in various places, particularly in Oranmore. So at the time that I joined, the lettering was called Oranmore Monumental. Yep. And he was very clear with me that it needed to be a sans serif type, so without any fiddly bits, because it was for a pub and they needed to wash the floor. That's why the letters need to look like they do, because they'll be good for mopping. And I was absolutely dead set on that, and I was happy with that. So the job was to take Alasdair's lettering, which he called Oranmore Monumental, but actually when I looked at it further, these letters had been evolving and coming through for a long time, and they'd come from various places that things he was interested in, but he wasn't bothered about where they come from anymore. He wasn't interested in referencing them. He had a kind of logic of how the letters were constructed, this kind of rational idea of pulling something apart and understanding it from its kind of most bare bones. And he wanted it to function as a typeface. And a typeface and lettering are different things. A typeface is something that you can use, either one that's gone through a technological process where you can repeat the letters as many times as you want, either by hitting a key on a keyboard or by having lots of them made into wood or into metal. Whatever the technology is you're using, a typeface needs to be repeatable to all intents and purposes, identical letters. And Alasdair's letters, as he had them, were each individual little kind of JPEG letters that he could arrange for things like the Hillhead mural. But when you turn artist letters into a typeface, there's technological considerations with it. I think type suited Alasdair in a way because it's very micro and also very macro. You need to be on top of what's happening in the big overall sense to get the effect and the character of the thing, whilst also making sure that the micro parts actually work. So there was a lot of that iterative working that John spoke about, where you're going back to how does it function, how does it work, the bare bones of the thing. I put together a small team of myself. After he'd asked me, he'd emailed me from the hospital and said, "Edwin, would you still be interested in working on this?" And I said, yes. He wanted to get the typeface functioning so that he could use it for his partner, Morag McAlpine's headstone, which is over in Dumbarton, which he refused to call Dumbarton with an M and a B because he said that was silly. Because it was dumb. And he wanted to make sure that happened. And part of making sure that happened was having a functioning typeface. I put together a team of myself, Neil Maguire, who's a colleague, who at the time was a colleague in the art school and still a colleague in making graphic things, and a recently graduated student type designer called Imogen Ayres, who had a small company. And between the three of us and some consultancy, we knew that we could manage to get it through. It needed to be people who were in Glasgow so that we could actually work with Alasdair, because it wasn't going to work over email. It wasn't going to be kind of pinging PDFs back and forth. It needed to be people. I live around the corner from Alasdair, so it was mostly me going round to his house and then us working together on sheets that had been drawn out and that kind of thing. So the micro and the macro thing, the typeface needs to work in both ways, and Alasdair kept coming back to the micro parts, but we'd gone, the lettering didn't have a lowercase, and lowercase letters, their structures come from a different place. They're not really related to the Roman uppercase, and their structures are more complex, and they don't work with what Alasdair had done. Is like rationale for how the thick and the thin parts worked in the typeface was based on the uppercase, and it was based on a very kind of geometrical understanding of how that worked. And again, he wasn't really worried about the niceties of typographic orthodoxy, but at the same time, he wanted it to function orthodoxly as a typeface that could actually be used for setting text. And eventually, we got to the point where the lowercase was working well, but there was a lot of that iterative going backwards and forwards, and there was a lot of starting right back at the beginning again, so that Alasdair could understand how his rules were being adapted and placed into something that was too complex to work with the basic structures that he'd given us at the beginning of the project. All of that happened.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds extremely complicated, and perhaps he hadn't realised quite what he was getting himself into either there, but we're very glad that he did.
Yeah.
Sort of push through.
Yeah, maybe. I think he knew what he wanted. He knew he wanted it to function. Yeah. And at some point he said, I can't follow this any further. Mm-hmm. And I remember actually at the time he said, maybe it's my age, but okay, this seems fine. You do the last finishing parts and let's get it wrapped up and out in the real world.
And I think that's lovely that actually it was the impetus was to create Morag's headstone, and just to sort of mention that if you visit the Alasdair Gray archives, which I really recommend you do, there is a wonderful little sort of book of tribute that he's put together for Morag. That is just a really beautiful document. So you should go and check that out as well. She was obviously extremely important to him, especially in those later years. Now I'd like to ask you, David. So microphone back to David. So yours is a slightly different role, I suppose, than sort of collaborating on that kind of level. But I think you would agree that the portrait, taking a portrait of someone, is by nature collaborative. We've had a lovely long conversation about this previously, haven't we? So I'd like you to just sort of, it's a significant part of your work, portraiture. It was also a significant part of Byrne's and Gray's, as we can see surrounding us here. So yeah, what draws you to portraiture, and how did that, how can we discuss that in the context of these two?
This is a question I still find really difficult to answer. I'm going to break it down. I think it's, for me, it offers an introduction to a life, events, an individual, something that you ordinarily wouldn't. And I'm going to move slightly off. The best way I can describe this has nothing to do with John or Alasdair. And it was I was fortunate, mid-90s, I made a series of portraits for British Vogue, and one of the sitters was a lady called Eve Arnold. And Eve was one of the founding members of the Magazine Photo Agency. And I became quite friendly with Eve after it. And she sent me this lovely gift. I don't know if you know the movie The Misfits, but one of her best friends was Marilyn Monroe. And there's a shot in the desert of Monroe standing in profile as we go. So Eve sent this through to me, and the next time I was down, she lived in Mount Street in London, and the next time I went down to see her, this to me sums up portraiture to a certain extent. I had made a 2D version of an interpretation of how I saw Eve, and for what it is, Eve liked the portrait. But she told me this story about this painting, and to say it was photographed in the Nevada desert. There was a lot of chaos during the filming of The Misfits. And she said to me, and Marilyn came into the Winnebago at the end of that, a couple of takes. She was soaking in sweat, the makeup was running, she lay down and just crashed out. And she said, I started photographing her, David. And she said to me, Eve, don't photograph me, I want to look beautiful. And Eve Arnold said to me, David, I told her, Marilyn, you are beautiful, I'm making you interesting. Now, that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't got to meet Eve Arnold through photography. So it's not initially just the first surface connection, it's made in a representation. So it comes from it, it develops from it. And I wrote a little thing, can I read this?
Of course, yeah.
Because I've thought about this myself, and I've been asked it a few times, what is a portrait? You get a lot of students primarily say, does a portrait capture the soul? So I scribbled a little bit on a project I'm working with, it's on my website at the moment. And bear with me, I'm dyslexic, so I'm not the best reader in the world. But a portrait is not only how a sitter looks, but how they wish to be seen. Its success or failure is measured not only by the author and sitter, but likewise interpretation of someone who views it. A stranger often and rarely a witness to the event. A portrait is a collaboration, most likely a hope, a viewpoint with some context. Perhaps it may be a battle of minds, other times a gentle quietness shared. Time to time, history may deem the moment as being of great value. Equally, the value can be beyond measure in the case of a personal association, a simple snapshot of a loved one. Does a portrait capture or reflect a soul? Question I'm often asked. The easy answer being whose? The subjects, the author, or perhaps even the viewers. The human being is far too considered and complex a subject for a single exposure to sum up. In the same manner, a single sentence taken from a book rarely tells the entire story. Whilst both the portrait and the sentence from the book may only offer an insight and suggestion of the greater picture, it is possible that a single sentence or a brief exposure equally may be the most powerful statement within 100 pages or indeed a life lived. So it's a complex subject to answer, so I'm not being flippant about it, but the one thing I use photography primarily as an introduction. It's more a fascination with the person. And I realised that one time, I was in New York, and my wife, when we used to live just outside Glasgow, and she phoned me and said, people always start this conversation, now don't panic. It's the worst thing to say to anybody. So she said, no, don't panic, but the house burned down last night. Rachel, our daughter, she's fine and so is the guinea pig. So fine, okay. But ironically, I had just brought my life's work, my negatives, back to the house after 5 years of being in storage. And I suppose if you said to most photographers, you know, what would you think if you'd lost most of your life work? And there was people in this who you will never get the chance to photograph again, you know, the men that have passed away. But it's like, so she said, you know, the negatives, a lot of them are destroyed. And I never bothered. I just thought, fine, because there was something triggered in my mind, and this comes back to what portrait means to me and the connection. I realised the negatives, they were the key, they were the introduction for me to meet people that I found interesting. And those memories still existed. The negatives that were the key have been destroyed. And in a kind of ironic way, the purpose of the negative was to record an event. And by this fire, I had recorded a second event in my life. And then an even other way of thinking about it, this was at 7:30 in the morning, so give me some credit trying to figure this out, to stay calm, that I thought those negatives that were primarily invented for a means of reproduction, all of a sudden became individual pieces. So even if it was the two frames, 2/50 of a second apart, they were different now, because the negatives had twisted, gnarled, cracked. And I thought, and one day I'll probably will put an exhibition on of just the negatives. So the photography side of it, it's not that important to me. It's more, that's the key, that's the excuse to get to meet people and grow, you know, friendships with people like John and hear the stories that you ordinarily wouldn't get. And even for the short period of time, I was thinking about, I have photographed Alasdair twice. One was in the art club across the road and one was up at the house. And it's really interesting what you guys are saying, you know, revisiting things and doing all that, because that's what I meant by Alasdair going down a country road, because you never knew what was coming next, even in the short period I was working with him. Where John, you sort of knew, we're going to go down this road.
I was going to say, because you made this lovely analogy of the novel and how an amazing portrait might just happen to be the most important sentence of the novel.
Yeah.
And now, I think Byrne's probably someone who was well aware of that and was perhaps trying to give you that. Whereas, would you say, Alasdair, you know, what is that right?
Well, because John and I had a relationship.
Yes.
Alasdair and I never. And for me, the primary thing is they both are collaborators, because they only can give, you know, to a certain extent what I coax. But John, I suppose trust comes into it. John knew me. Mm-hmm. You know, I didn't know Alasdair. We could talk about, you know, Ridley, but it wasn't the same Ridley that we both grew up on. In his youth. So
he also, I suppose, John was also trying to visually tell a story, you know, with his own.
I just think
aesthetic.
they're different ways. I think Alasdair and I think both were very similar in many ways and very different in other ways. Both were very complex. Both couldn't do anything but create. That's all they could do. In their mind, they lived to create, and when they stopped creating, that was it. You know, so I think Alasdair was very much, you could tell in his manner. The one thing, I've been very fortunate with my previous life experience working in a prison and then working, you can see how things are developing sometimes and you can react to them. And you could tell with Alasdair, you had to be 3 steps ahead in some forms. You had to know to put him in a position where you knew you were going to work, create something, you watched him laugh, so how do I make him laugh? There was wee things like that. With John, it was more a comfort thing that had been formed over years. You know, I think John was a pal.
Yeah.
You know, Alasdair was someone I admired and I wanted to photograph, but I didn't know Alasdair as such. You know, I'm being, you know, honest about
Very
that.
different.
Yeah, they were very different, but I think I would focus on that both still retained a childlike approach to what their passions were. But Alasdair was very much in that short period, and obviously seeing his work and hearing this is really interesting what I've heard about. It doesn't surprise me that he could remember every corner, because if I'm being brutally frank, I think nobody in this room thought like Alasdair Gray. And I think John, you could see a little bit of yourself always in John. I'm not sure I could ever see any of myself in Alasdair, because Alasdair was always 3 thoughts ahead or doing something, different.
Yeah.
Where John was more, there was no immediate surprise sprung on you. Alasdair was a windy road, you sort of shit corner. Where John, it was more, there's a service station up here, we can chill.
Yeah.
And that was the feeling I got.
Thank you. I have failed and I have not kept time very well. So there are a few more questions that maybe we'll come back round to at the end, but I really want to give everybody in the audience a chance to ask what they'd like to. So I will pass over my mic to anybody who'd like to direct a question to anyone today. Any questions out there for any of our speakers? Yes, we've got one over there. 2 seconds. I'll just come to you. Nice question.
Did they ever threaten to collaborate together? Was that ever mooted, or was that a non-starter, or did they hang out?
Social might be the...
Yeah, they did really know each other that. Well, like I say, there was, they operated in slightly different circles. There were crossovers, but they were quite different too, weren't they? I'd say politically maybe they had similarities, but kind of differences, so I wouldn't say fully aligned. But I think from what everyone said here today, and to reflect on their ways of making, they're so similar. So rooted in place, obviously East End of Glasgow, Paisley for John, and so much about reflecting those experiences within their work, so much around collaborating with others. Glasgow Print Studios is probably the best in terms of offering that insight between them too, and that comparisons as practitioners as well, and also that polymaths in which they made across the visual, the literary theatre, which obviously was an area that John had been more success in than Alasdair. So there were so many comparisons and similarities, but quite different, I would say. And it's interesting that you said that they both came to you at a similar time, although their orbits were quite different.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you're maybe wondering why I passed it to Byrne, but this is Social Dallas, who looks after the Alasdair Great Archive, and you've represented him for years, very long-term collaborator and praise yourself. And yeah, I think really also the subject of this exhibition is something we kind of had to do posthumously, because they didn't collaborate. I mean, they did see themselves as sort of that akin in some ways, but clearly there were, like not very, very common threads in their uniqueness really, and just the extraordinary talent. I mean, that is why I think they're so well loved, isn't it? It's just that they're absolutely extraordinary, and there happen to be 2 of them who come out of a similar area at a similar time. So Claire's got an insight for us.
I was just going to say, their orbits cross so much, but actually maybe it was good because it would have almost been like Ghostbusters, the streams crossing. The 2 of them had an unending, it's like, I don't know what you want to call it, like a Jedi Force or a drive or Ghostbusters proton pack, this stream of energy that never rested, and it would maybe manifest in different ways, but the 2 of them, I've seen it a little bit in some other people, but the 2 of them, it was an incredible power. Could potentially have been dangerous, Gary, to who could have contained that collaboration. Really amazing, and it came out in different ways through different mediums, but also as we're discussing different ways of working, like Nichol, we too know about typeface. So yes, Alasdair. Even at rest, he didn't really rest. He would come back and rework things. As Source will probably tell you, it's sometimes not when people wanted things reworked. So paintings that were borrowed for exhibition might go back with a new background on to the buyer or collector, which I'm not sure was always appreciated. But yeah, Alasdair would always revisit his works, and even in the middle of a proof, he might. And he would use whatever was available. So he would use Tipex, but also sticky notes. For example, if he wanted, we'd maybe do it. So a proof is a test print. So it's one of the stages we go through when we're making a print. He would decide he wanted to see right now what it looked like with a bit more border. So he would whip out his envelope labels and extend the canvas using those, and then Tipex out a bunch of stuff. And then I'd have to go and try and persuade, we eventually invested in a scanner, but I'd have to persuade someone at a reprographics bureau to try and feed this like mountainous bit of paper built up Tipex through the scanner so that we could then recreate the next bit. But yeah, it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened. But yeah, I'm not sure actually it would have been able to contain that amount of power. I think.
Also, I think as well, when you work with Alasdair or John, you were very, very much at their disposal. They wanted you, you know what I mean? They weren't like really needy or anything like that, but they liked the comfort of you sort of doing what they wanted to do. And it's like they wouldn't want someone else involved with a sort of similar mindset, getting them just too much of a distraction. They just wanted you were with them and that was it. And they liked that really. And again, that comes down to the collaboration. You've got to sort of invest your time with them and sort of just give yourself up to them when you're actually working with them, and that's why you get the sort of best results.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Hope that's our way to answer it. Anyone else want to ask anything? Lovely, thank you. I'll just pass you this.
Yeah, I would like to ask specifically in relation to portraiture and image making. How do you approach, when you're working in a collaboration with such a skilled artist, how do you approach that differently as to if you were taking a portrait of a model or someone that's been, it's known with a sort of commission or saying
I don't, because I think it all comes down to, if you start with a bucket full of authenticity, you're okay, because that's what it is. It's just a general interest in someone else, or you want to find out more about them, or everybody's got a story, so it's finding that out, and you approach things differently. You may not, you'll communicate, you'll talk about different things possibly, and then things develop from that. So I never have. So I just, well, here's the kind of funny thing. I was asked from a friend who was a fashion designer, chap Derek Walker, who wanted to make him up with a campaign for his tweets. I thought, I know the right guy for this. And Derek was thinking of some 25-year-old or something. And at that point, I'm thinking a 65-year-old, and it was John. So if that had been the first time, obviously it wasn't. I'd photographed John a lot of times before that. Was John the model? Was the actor? Was he the man? Who was he? So for me, as I say, it's not any different if it's a 25-year-old, young model or whatever. You try and just bring in something out. That's why I didn't like the term fashion. I never worked in fashion. I had a meeting this morning about it with a TV production company who were talking about fashion. And I was saying, first you have to identify the difference between fashion and style. And I was more interested in the person and the story, and even if it was a performance, but I was never interested in I don't like, categorising things like that.
Did you find that you wanted to spend a bit of time with them before you took the portrait?
Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you can spend too long. With John, you sort of, it fell into autopilot that we knew. And you guys all know John Byrne, Alasdair Gray, so, from a visual point of view, you get a really good starting block. Imagine John Major walked in, you'd be like, what am I going to do here? So it does aid to that. In terms of getting to know them, I knew John. Getting to know Alasdair, what I would always say is, before I ever went in to photograph anybody, I would try and find out as much about them as I could. But that was always just in the back, just in case sometimes. Because you could tell, if you're, I was fortunate, I sort of learned my trade, and I was in my early 30s at this point, when I graduated at 31 from photography. But I remember, for most of the time I was working at Condé Nast at GQ and things, so we were photographing a lot of famous people and a lot of actors. And I remember saying to an actor one time in LA, I just want you to be yourself. And he said to me, David, I don't know how to do that. And that's kind of what it's like. So when you get artists, they're brilliant. And you see the traits in different people. You see, when somebody would come into the studio, you take control of the situation in the nicest way. But with somebody like John or Alasdair, you're talking about artists, so you just know that you can talk about anything,
Thank you. Thanks very much. I just wanted to maybe time for one last question, or if anybody on the panel had any sort of last things they wanted to say. I had a little one that I did want to get in, and it's, feel free to jump in, any of you. It's just more about their legacy, really, and their influence. Because, many of you will collaborate and still work with upcoming artists. Do you see the sort of reverberation of their impact coming up behind us today? Yeah.
I do. So I work at the art school. I work in communication design, which is like graphics, illustration, photography. This year, Michael Peterson, the writer and poet, the illustration students were working with him. A lot of them chose his story about Alasdair Gray to work with, and some of them made some really beautiful work, and they were off down to the archive. There have been students doing a lot of printing that's influenced within the case room, within the letterpress, in design, but that's influenced either by his stories, the short stories particularly over the last couple of years, have really, I don't know, just seem to be there. People are coming in with things that, illustrations that they've come up with and devices for those short stories. So influencing, I've seen a bit of the aesthetic, I've seen a lot of the short stories, but I spend a bit of time down the archive and I see all sorts of young, interesting people down there.
Yeah.
Who, I guess, before I was going to the archive, before I knew what it was, I didn't know who used the archive. And it's quite a wide range of people, but there's lots of people in under 30 who are using the Alasdair Gray archive, who are down there, who are involved in the projects, and that's partly because Sorcia's really interested in opening things out to them, but it's partly because that's an age group who are really excited about Alasdair's work.
Yeah.
I think, loads of people probably read Lanark for the first time when they were at the art school, and I don't think that's changed.
Yeah, or will. Yeah.
Or will, yeah.
I was just going to sort of add to that as well, just in terms of both their legacies, but I think I said before to Sorcia that I find it hard to understand that Alasdair is actually no longer here, because that sort of Jedi force that I was talking about, that was pushing him always to make and remake and to revisit, it meant that really the way we worked with him very much was a kind of non-linear time-based situation where something might be finished, oh no, it's not finished, and we would go back in time to remake things or revisit things. So we got used to sort of a non-linear time around Alasdair. So for me, I still feel he might appear at some point and be like, he actually did, when he was back from hospital and he was in his room a lot, that was very, very dangerous for us, because in his room he had a lot of his paintings but also prints on the wall, and he had spent a lot of time with them because he was in bed. So we think we remade Lanark, the prints, and nearly for a third time as well, actually, after another little session of looking at them. So for me, his sort of his life force, his sort of Jedi force of creativity and making, sort of permeates everything and lasts forever, really, in the work that he had, and also in what he's left with all of us. And the same with John as well. The sort of warmth that he instilled has really changed everybody that came across him. And both of them have got legacies for young people. We have the John Byrne Award, which was for an award for young people to pursue painting, and also through Sorcia, there's lots of incredible opportunities for people, and we're actually hoping to do a shared creative commission for somebody maybe not from print, because that's the great thing about the print studio and having master printers like Scott, is that people from all walks of life can come and learn how to print, or be given an amazing opportunity to have an extra set of hands that's there translating what's in their mind and trying to make manifest. And if you can make manifest what's in Alasdair's mind into the real world, then you could do it for everybody. So yeah, lots of great legacies, and we're seeing people, young people particularly, like Edwin saying, really revisiting their works and being really interested, looking in our archive as well. Just a tiny plug there, we have an archive at the Print Studio. Come visit it. Thank you.
On a Wednesday.
On a Wednesday. On a Wednesday. Thank you. Anything you'd like to add, Nichol?
The only thing I'd add is when you speak to young artists, they talk about John and Alasdair, and it's a voyage of discovery for a lot of young artists. And there's so much to discover, there's so much work, and both of them characterised by incredible amounts of work, an incredible breadth of the work that they engaged with, which is brilliant. And one of the key things that I think is the legacy of both these artists is that young artists are starting to have a belief that they can do all of these things. Because there's the plays, there's the films, there's the wonderful things that the drawings, the books, all of this stuff is to be discovered. And this is the legacy that really lives for artists that I talk to, is that they see this and they think, maybe I can do that. And that's for me is a really beautiful legacy.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that feels like a really nice note to leave it on. So I just wanted to again thank the panel so much. That was fascinating. I've really enjoyed myself, and I hope our audience have as well. Thank you for coming. And yeah, there's maybe a round of applause for our panellists, please.